You disintegrated Einstein.
Calm down, Marty. I didn't disintegrate anything. The molecular structure of both Einstein and the car are completely intact.
Where the hell are they?
They have gone back to basics.
We have actually borrowed that video from another church, but it's pretty cool, isn't it? They gave it to us to use. Good morning. Well, it's good to see you again. My name's Simon. I'm the lead minister here, and we're kicking off this new series, Back to Basics. Just apologies if you wanted to chat to me afterwards. Well, I've got to dash off straight away because we're going straight down to Essex, centre of the universe, after this, because my dad's coming out of hospital. My sister's chosen this week to be on holiday, and I've got to spend most of the week sitting in his house waiting for work people to come in and do jobs and everything. So I'm kind of hired hand this week. But that's fine. That's good. That's what being a son's all about, isn't it? Well, I don't know if you scroll through headlines. I mean, I like sometimes to look at the BBC News and I just pick out some headlines and look at what today's headlines in the papers are. But nowadays, when you scroll through social media, like Blue Sky or Instagram, I don't do Twitter anymore. I don't like Twitter anymore I won't say any more about that, but Blue Sky instead. But when you scroll through and you look for headlines, but sometimes headlines can be pretty misleading. These are real headlines. A couple of examples for you here. Bridge held up by red tape. I mean, this is what came to my mind. And how about this one? Astronaut takes blame for gas in spacecraft. Well, my imagination really ran away with myself there. Life moves fast. We scroll, we skim, we swipe past anything that takes too long. We want the headline just to get to the nub of it. But here's the problem. Headlines don't always tell the whole story. Instead of giving clarity, they can manipulate or distort or sensationalize or just stir up an emotion in us. And there's a danger that we can do that when it comes to faith. We can just go for the headlines, for the basic points, for the summary, and actually it doesn't sum up what it's all about. We don't get the whole story. And that gives us a version of faith that isn't real. And then when we have that, we build our faith on the wrong foundations. I've talked to people who've gone for a headline, and it's the wrong one. People have said things like, faith, it's just all about following a load of rules, isn't it? Faith, it's just taking a leap in the dark, isn't it? It's blind. Just believe, don't question it. Faith, well, that's all about God wanting us to be good people. Faith, well, that's all about having a religion, isn't it? Now, maybe you've got one of those headlines or you've heard one of those headlines, but what if they're not the full story? What if you've been handed a version of faith that's disconnected from the real thing? Maybe the headlines that you got made faith look like a set of beliefs to sign up for, a standard of behavior you have to conform to, a set of rituals that you need to perform, a religion that you need to adhere to. But it was never meant to be about jumping through hoops or being religious or meeting a standard. Faith syncs us with God's story. Now, I tried out this little saying with my wife, and she's very clever, but she's not really a techie person. She said, "What on earth do you mean?" But those of us who are techie know what I mean. But let me explain for those of you who are not. Now, I sometimes talk to people who are like evangelists for Apple. When people look at Apple, they say, "You've got to have a Mac. You've got to have a Mac." And I do what I did with my boys, and I say, "You paying? You paying?" I'm not paying that amount of money. When I've talked to people who have Apple technology, they say it's brilliant. It syncs with all of your devices, and what they mean is, that when you put something on your phone, it goes on your laptop, and it goes on your tablet, and it goes on your bathroom wall or whatever other devices that they have. I don't know, but what they don't realise actually is Apple Mac fans don't listen to this. Apple Mac fans, they don't realise actually that Google does it as well. Android does it too. They think they're the only ones in the universe, but don't tell them that. Well, keep them happy. Keep them happy. But syncs. Everything kind of holds together, and faith actually brings us in line. It aligns us. It syncs us with God's story, because it's a response to what God has said and has done. That big story that he made those promises, and they were fulfilled in Jesus, and Jesus came among us and died on the cross and rose again and returns again and gives us new life. It's an anticipation of what God's going to do. It connects us with him. It moves us forward. It opens us to the life that God wants us to live. So this Sunday, we're launching a brand new series where we're going to dispense with the headlines and go back to basics. No shortcuts, no fluff, just real, raw faith. Before we dive in, let me give you a straightforward definition of faith. Faith is saying yes to God and stepping into his story. You know, God's made us promises, God's revealed himself, God's spoken through the Bible, and we say yes to him and we step into his story. Actually, our life aligns with his, and he's at work in our life. And we see this in the passage that Deb's read to us a few minutes ago. And it was written to Jesus' followers who came from a Jewish background. And I'm going to call the writer of this letter the faith coach. We don't know who he was, or they just say the letter to the Hebrews. But I call him the faith coach. And he was explaining how the way of Jesus is better than the way that they approached God before they followed him. See, as Jewish people, they would have followed rules, sacrifices, and rituals. And the sad thing is, actually, all these things were supposed to be about faith. They were all supposed to point people to God and trust in him, and that God was working something big out. He had a big story, and that was fulfilled in Jesus. But unfortunately, they didn't see that. And Jesus came with something new, something built on trust, not performance. And that raised the big question: if the old way is about proving yourself, how does the new way work? Well, the answer, faith. And the faith coach puts it like this: faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. In other words, faith makes the unseen real. I remember a family used to have this verse in their toilet, which always I thought, I wonder if they struggle with constipation a bit. But every time I read that verse, now you can't get that out of your head now, can you? No. But what it's saying is that faith makes the unseen real. It's not wishful thinking. It's not blind optimism. It's a confidence that though you can't see what God's going to do, you have that assurance, you have that conviction that he's going to fulfill his purposes because God's working out his story. And we're part of that story. It's a conviction that what God says is true even before you see the truth. And it's an expectation that God will do what he's promised. It's moving forward even when the way isn't clear because you're confident that God's going to show up for you. It's gripping God's hand as the story unfolds. It's something relational. Now let me give you an example that's something that happens to me recently. But I was at a gig once from watching a band that none of you would have heard about, and I got chatting to this guy called Matt, really nice guy, and Matt actually promotes local gigs. He brought Richard Dawson here, he brought Kid Congo and the Pink Monkey Birds. Have you heard of them? Yeah, great band. But also he started this thing called the Nottingham Record Co-op. You know, and it's brilliant idea. And the idea is, well, they've got this trade account, and the idea is a private Facebook group. They get trade prices on records, and you just say, yep, I'll have the new Squid album, please. And when it comes in, he sends you a message and says, you know, pay me £20. You do it by PayPal. And then you go around to his address in Sherwood and collect it. And the idea is it saves you money. The idea is it saves money. You know, generally it's about £7 less a record. Don't know if it's quite done that with me because I've ended up ordering more records. Because I just say, yes, please, forget how much I'm paying. And then about 3 months later he says, oh, by the way, you owe me the money. But yesterday actually, I nipped up there. There were my records waiting for me, the new Doves album, an Asherah Temple album. They were waiting for me. And now, there was nothing when I was going along. There was no bit of paper saying, yes, I guarantee the records will be there. But why was I confident they were going to be there? Well, because I know the guy. I knew he's trustworthy. There's a kind of relational element in it. I wouldn't have done it had I not have known the guy in the first place. And everyone knows these guys who run it. They're the most popular guys in the music scene in Nottingham because they save us so much money. Actually, they cost us more, really, because we spend more on records. But see, it's relational. And that's the whole thing about faith. It's not blind, it's relational. We know God, and we can trust God and move forward with God. God wants to have a relationship with us, and he takes us step by step. Now, the whole faith thing was a radical shift for the people who first read this letter, because they were used to proving themselves by their action. The religious leaders of their day, they'd gone away actually from God's way, and they were saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to please God, you've got to meet a certain standard. And Jesus came along and just cast all that aside and said that was never God's way. So now these people were following Jesus. They were being told that what mattered most is faith, is trusting what God has done in Jesus and following him. So a little later, the Faith Coach makes this even clearer. He says, without faith living within us, notice it's living within us. It's not just this cold idea. It's something alive. It's part of a relationship. It would be impossible to please God. For we come to God in faith, knowing that he is real and that he rewards those who passionately seek him. Now, when he talks about pleasing God, he's not saying that we've got to do certain things to earn God's favor, to get in his good books. The word pleasure is all about bringing delight. It's when your child does something that really touches you, or they just reach out for your hand unexpectedly, or they say, Mummy, I love you, and can I have some breakfast now, please, or can I have some chocolate? But, the first bit, Mummy, I love you. But they bring real delight and pleasure, and that's the meaning of that. Without faith, we can't bring delight to God. God delights that we trust in him, because he knows that we're in it. We're in that relationship. And reward doesn't mean that God waits for us to do things and then gives us things in return. It just means that God responds. When we have faith, God responds. When we draw near to God, he draws near to us. Because faith is about a relationship with him. It's about trusting that God's good and that he loves us. So faith isn't about following religious rules. It's about trusting God enough to take the next step. So, the Faith Coach builds on this. Let's talk about Abraham, he says, the original faith pioneer. Now, if you're not a Jesus follower and you don't know much about the Bible, the name Abraham might not mean much to you, but it would have meant a whole lot to them. Abraham was a man who lived thousands and thousands of years ago, and he was a man who met with God. He was a man who encountered God. He was a nomad wandering around, and God got hold of him, and God spoke to him, and God made promises to him. God said, Abraham, I want to know you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. That's an amazing thing. But there was one problem. He had no kids. He had no kids to take on the name and to build into that generation. And he and Sarah were too old. It seemed impossible. But we're told that Abraham believed in God. In fact, other parts of the Bible say that Abraham was a friend of God. He had a relationship with God. Well, here, in this letter to the Hebrews, the Faith Coach focuses on the journey God sent him as an example of his faith. He says in verse 8, faith motivated Abraham to obey God's call and to leave the familiar to discover the territory. He was destined to inherit from God. God promised him a land to live in, where his children would settle, where the nation would grow. So he left with only a promise and without even knowing ahead of time where he was going. God said, I'm going to make you a nation. I'm going to give you a land. Trust me, I'm going to take you step by step to lead you towards that place. There was no route, no final destination given. And yet Abraham went. No sat-nav, no backup plan, just faith. Imagine that. Imagine deleting your entire comfort zone without knowing what comes next. It's like when you're driving and you're not sure where you're going and suddenly your sat-nav loses its signal. Well, maybe you're more confident than I am, but I get in a panic. Where am I? Who am I? Where am I going? What's going to happen? Abraham had no idea of anything except that God was going to lead him, and he trusted in him. He didn't just believe in God, he believed God. And that's a subtle difference there, because it meant that he had a relationship with God. He listened to God and responded. His faith didn't just impact him, it blazed a trail, and we're following that. And Abraham's story teaches us a key fact. Faith doesn't rely on what's in front of our noses. It relies on God. It brings us into God's story. This is what the writer, the Faith Coach, goes on to say. He said, he lived by faith as an immigrant in the promised land. See, when he got to that land that God had promised him, there were other people living there. You ever been, you ever arrived somewhere and you're going to pitch up your tent, you're going to go in your hotel room and someone's already in there? And then once we were on holiday in France on one of those Eurocamp holidays, and we could hear this right kerfuffle near us. And these people arrived, and their tent had been allotted to them. And when they got there was another family in there. There'd been a right mess up with the bookings, and they had to put them in another site. Actually, there was no room anywhere else. Well, that's kind of what Abraham got there. God, is this the land? But there's all these people living there. There's all these foreigners here. What am I going to do? But he trusted God. He trusted God and lived there as an immigrant until God settled them and gave them that land completely. He trusted God's story. And actually, it goes on to say that actually he looked not just for that place where he was settled. He looked for something in the future, a city whose builder and architect is God. In other words, he had his sight set on heaven, on God's complete purpose. And actually, we know so much more because we know Jesus fulfilled that and gives us that eternal future. And that's what gives me confidence when I see the world in such a mess. I don't know, I've kind of given up watching the news. I watched it a little bit on Thursday and got a little bit of hope. I watched it on Friday and saw 2 minutes of what was going on. I thought, I can't watch this. I just can't cope with this anymore. But do you know what keeps me going? Knowing actually God's got the story. God's going to complete the story. We're part of that eternal city. We're part of that eternal future. And if you're not a Jesus follower, we can tell you more about that. That this isn't where it all finishes. God's promised something great and he fulfills it in Jesus. And Abraham knew that. He glimpsed that and he trusted in that. And all this adds up to the fact that faith syncs us with God's story. So here's the question. What's your next move? If you're not a Jesus follower, I get it. You're curious, skeptical. Maybe you're just not sure about the whole thing. Well, there's no pressure. But what if there's more to Jesus than the headlines that you've been buying? How about just being open? How about asking a question? Maybe one that's been sitting at the back of your mind. No question is too silly. We might not be able to answer them, but we can grapple with them with you. Have a conversation with someone who actually lives faith out. Tell you, well, what is it that makes you tick? What's this all about? Dig a bit deeper. Don't just scroll past it, but check out what Jesus really said for yourself. Often I find people, they'll say to me, well, Jesus said money is the root of all evil. Did he? And let's have a look and find out about that. And actually, no, Jesus didn't say that. Actually, I think you'll find it somewhere else, and it says the love of money is the root of all evil. You see, all these assumptions that we kind of just buy. I remember someone went to a friend of mine, and he said, Christians say the earth is flat. Really? Oh, I've never heard that. Why do they say that? He said, well, because the Bible says the earth is flat. And he had a Bible with him, but he got a couple of Psalms out, and he said, look, if you look at this, it talks of the world as a sphere. I mean, the inference is the world isn't flat, it's round. I mean, that's the whole influence there. That's the whole inference there. Even though they didn't have the technology or the science to know that, the Bible kind of makes that clear. The world's a sphere that we know as, the round world that we live in, that astronauts have seen. Why not give it a try? Maybe just one small step. You've got nothing to lose. It might just change everything. And we've got a great opportunity coming out because you can sign up for Alpha and go and see Colin. And we're going to start an Alpha group really quickly. No pressure there, just to understand and ask your questions and work them through. Now, if you are a Jesus follower, I want to ask you a question, a bit of a tricky question. Are you in sync with God's story? Because sometimes, what we do is, we start off well, we're trusting God, we've got that faith, we're in sync with God's story, we're moving forward with him, with his story for our life, and our life is part of what he's doing. And then we kind of veer off course. And then we get like the religious leaders in the New Testament who clash with Jesus. It's all about actually following the rules and regulations. It's all about what we do. And we lose the reality of it, the relationship with God. It happens to all of us. It happens so easily. And let's all ask ourselves that question. It's time to strip back and rediscover the real, raw, life-changing faith in Jesus. And every so often, we've just got to get back to basics and get back to that place. And here's how you can do it this week. Live it out. Let faith shape your daily life. Ask yourself, how am I going to live out God's story? Choose patience in a tough moment. Show kindness when it's inconvenient. Trust God when there's uncertainty. And then step up. Have an honest conversation with someone about what faith really is. You don't have to bash around it with the Bible, but just share with them what God's done in your life. And then go deeper. Spend time with God, not out of duty, but reconnect with him, with the truth that fuels your faith. Remember, faith syncs us with God's story. And when we get back to basics, we discover what it really is. It's stepping into God's story. It's trusting him. It's moving forward. It's living out his will for us. And we're going to explore that a lot more throughout this month.